young woman sat quietly on the edge of her bed, her fingers tracing the keys of an old piano that had been in her family for years. The wood was worn smooth from countless hours of practice, and the keys had a faint yellow tint from age. She loved this piano more than anything, though it had never been easy for her. Every day, she would sit down and let the music flow, but sometimes it felt like the music knew more about her fears than she did. Ever since she was a child, she had dreamed of performing on a big stage. She imagined lights shining down on her, the audience holding their breath, and the music filling the entire room. It was a dream that had grown with her, one she nurtured quietly, often alone in her small room. But even with all her practice, there was a voice inside her that whispered doubts. What if she made a mistake? What if no one liked what she played? That voice had been there for as long as she could remember, always reminding her that the world was bigger than her music and maybe too big for her confidence. She remembered the first time she really fell in love with the piano. She was just 7 years old, small hands barely reaching the keys. She had pressed one note and then another, and suddenly she felt something magical, as if the piano had spoken directly to her heart. From that moment on, she practiced every day, even when it meant missing out on games with other children or staying inside while the sun shone bright outside. The piano had become her best friend, her safe place, and sometimes, her only place where she felt truly understood. Her parents noticed her dedication and always encouraged her, but they never pushed her to perform. They knew she was shy and wanted her to love music for herself first. Still, she sometimes wondered if she would ever have the courage to share it with anyone else. She watched videos of famous pianists on the internet, seeing them on huge stages with lights and cameras, and felt a mix of inspiration and fear. She wanted that for herself, but her heart would beat fast just thinking about standing in front of an audience. Now, as she prepared for an upcoming music competition, all those feelings came rushing back. The competition was not far away, and it was the first time she would play in front of a large audience. She felt a knot in her stomach thinking about all the eyes that would be on her, waiting to see if she would succeed or fail. She tried to calm herself by practicing at home, repeating the pieces over and over until her fingers knew every note by heart. But no matter how perfect her practice was, the thought of performing for strangers made her hands tremble. The day of the competition arrived, and she woke up early, feeling a strange mix of excitement and fear. She looked at herself in the mirror, adjusting her simple dress and brushing her hair, trying to feel confident. She whispered to herself, telling herself that she could do this, that all those years of practice had led to this moment. Still, doubt lingered, creeping into her thoughts like a shadow she could not shake. She took a deep breath and tried to focus on the music, on the feeling of the keys beneath her fingers, and not on the crowd that awaited her. At the venue, the room was larger than she expected. The stage was elevated, the lights bright and warm, and the audience slowly filling the seats. She could hear murmurs and laughter, the shuffling of feet, and the occasional cough. Her heart pounded harder with every passing moment. She felt tiny and exposed, like a small bird about to take flight in a storm. Her palms were sweaty, and her stomach churned, but she reminded herself to breathe, to remember why she loved the piano and why she wanted to share that love with others. Backstage, she found a quiet corner and sat down. Her sheet music was in front of her, neatly arranged, but she barely looked at it. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Excitement, fear, hope, and anxiety all tangled together. She closed her eyes and tried to picture herself at the piano, the way she had practiced countless times at home. She imagined the notes flowing effortlessly, her fingers gliding over the keys, and the music carrying her beyond the fear. But when she opened her eyes and looked at the stage, the reality of the audience waiting for her made her knees weak. She could hear the announcer calling the next performer, and her name was mentioned. Her heart skipped a beat, and she felt a sudden rush of panic. She wanted to run, to hide, to escape from the pressure that weighed on her so heavily. But then, she remembered the feeling of the piano speaking to her heart, the way it had always been there to comfort and guide her. She took another deep breath, telling herself that this was her moment, that she had the power to let the music speak for her. Slowly, She walked onto the stage. The lights were blinding, and the faces of the audience were like shadows in the bright glow. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Every step toward the piano felt heavy, like moving through water, but she forced herself to keep going. When she finally reached the bench, she sat down and adjusted her posture, placing her fingers gently on the keys. The room was completely silent, waiting for her to start. For a long moment, she hesitated. She stared at the piano, feeling the weight of all her years of practice, all her dreams and fears, pressing down on her. Her hands shook slightly, and she wondered if she was truly ready. Doubt whispered in her ear, telling her that she might fail, that the audience might laugh or lose interest. She closed her eyes, trying to find the courage within herself, trying to remember why she loved this music and why it had always been her safe place. Then, she remembered something her music teacher had once said: "The piano doesn't care about fear. It only wants to tell your story." Those words echoed in her mind, soft but firm, reminding her that the music was bigger than her doubts. She took a deep breath, feeling a tiny spark of bravery flicker inside her. She placed her fingers on the keys, letting them hover for a moment, and then pressed down on the first note. The sound filled the room, soft but clear, like a whisper that demanded attention. The audience leaned forward slightly, sensing the beginning of something special. She felt a shiver run down her spine, but it was not fear this time. It was the excitement of finally sharing her music, of letting her heart speak through the piano. She closed her eyes and let the notes guide her, feeling each one as it rose and fell, carrying her beyond the bright lights and the watching eyes. Time seemed to slow as she played the opening lines of her piece. Every note felt alive, as if the piano itself was breathing with her, speaking the words she could not say aloud. She remembered all the lonely hours of practice, the moments of doubt, and the quiet triumphs when she had finally mastered a difficult passage. All of it came together in this single moment, and she realized that this was what she had been working toward all her life. She was not just playing notes. She was telling her story. The audience remained silent, captivated by the gentle power of the music. She could sense their attention, but it did not frighten her. Instead, it gave her strength. Each note seemed to erase a little bit of her fear, and she felt herself becoming more confident with every measure. The piano was no longer just an instrument. It was an extension of herself, a voice that could express everything she had kept inside. For the first time, she felt completely at home on the stage, despite the bright lights and the watching eyes. As she reached the end of her piece, her fingers lingered on the last note, letting it resonate through the room. The silence that followed was heavy, almost tangible, as if the audience was holding its breath, not wanting to break the spell. She opened her eyes slowly, looking up at the crowd, and saw faces filled with awe and admiration. She felt a rush of relief and joy, knowing that she had faced her fear and let the piano speak for her. The applause began softly at first, then grew louder, filling the room with warmth and energy. She smiled, a genuine, radiant smile, feeling the joy of accomplishment wash over her. She had hesitated under the spotlight, yes, but now she understood that the music could carry her beyond her fear, that it could speak louder than words ever could. She rose from the bench, bowing slightly, her heart full, and left the stage with a newfound sense of courage and hope. She knew that this was only the beginning, and that her love for the piano would continue to guide her through every challenge that lay ahead. The next morning, she woke up feeling a strange mixture of pride and anxiety. Yesterday's performance had been a small triumph, but the memory of her hesitation under the bright stage lights still lingered. She sat by the window, watching the sun rise and trying to recall the feelings that had taken over her heart. The applause had been wonderful, but it was not the applause she remembered most. It was the way the piano had felt alive beneath her fingers, as if it had been telling her story while she merely followed its lead. She knew that today she had to face another challenge. A local music teacher had invited her to a small recital at a nearby school. It was not a competition, but it meant another audience, another chance to show herself. The thought both excited and terrified her. She could feel her stomach tighten just thinking about sitting at another piano, with more eyes watching and more expectations looming. Every step of progress seemed to bring her closer to her dream, but the closer she got, the heavier the fear became. At home, she practiced for hours. She went through every piece she planned to perform, repeating tricky passages until her fingers moved almost automatically. Yet no amount of practice seemed to ease the tension in her chest. She stopped often, staring at the keys, remembering how her hands had trembled yesterday. The piano was waiting, patient and understanding, but she could feel her own doubts whispering, reminding her of every tiny mistake she had ever made. Her mother came into the room and watched her for a moment. She did not say anything at first, simply observing the concentration on her daughter's face, the way she leaned slightly forward, and the subtle trembling of her fingers. Finally, she spoke softly, "Remember, it's not about perfection. Just let the music speak." Her words were simple, yet they carried a weight of truth that seemed to settle in her heart. She nodded, feeling a little lighter, but the fear was still there, like a shadow she could not shake. Later that afternoon, she arrived at the school for the recital. The room was smaller than the competition hall, but it felt just as daunting. Chairs were set up in neat rows, and parents and students were already taking their seats. She could hear the soft murmur of conversations, the squeak of shoes on the polished floor, and the occasional cough. Her pulse quickened as she walked toward the piano placed at the front of the room. She had not yet played for such a casual audience, and the uncertainty of their reactions made her uneasy. Backstage, or rather behind a small screen at the side, she sat quietly. She watched the performers before her, each one walking confidently onto the stage and playing their pieces with ease. She admired their courage but felt her own confidence shrink. She wondered if she could ever be as calm and controlled, or if her hesitation would show once again. She ran her fingers over the keys of a small practice piano nearby, feeling the familiar texture, letting the notes echo in her mind, preparing herself for the moment she would have to perform. Finally, her name was called. She took a deep breath and walked to the piano. The room seemed still, almost holding its breath in anticipation. She adjusted the bench, placed her hands on the keys, and looked up briefly at the audience. Faces turned toward her, some encouraging, some curious, and some entirely blank. Her heart raced, but she told herself to focus only on the piano, only on the music that had always been her companion. The first note came slowly. It was soft, almost hesitant, but it set the tone for the rest of her performance. Her hands shook slightly, but as the melody progressed, she began to find the rhythm within herself. Each note became a step away from fear and a step toward courage. She remembered yesterday's performance, the way the music had spoken through her, and she allowed herself to follow that memory, trusting the piano to guide her once more. The audience listened quietly, the room filled with the soft sounds of the piano. Some faces relaxed as they became absorbed in the music, while others watched with admiration. She noticed a young girl sitting in the front row, her eyes wide and focused on every movement of the performer's hands. The young woman realized that her music was not only expressing her own feelings, but also touching others. It was a subtle reminder that music could communicate emotions that words often failed to convey. As the piece continued, she lost awareness of the audience. The nervousness that had weighed her down moments before faded, replaced by the simple joy of creating sound. The piano seemed to respond to her touch, whispering softly yet powerfully, carrying her emotions into the room. Every chord, every delicate note, felt as if it was breathing life into the space, telling a story only she could narrate through her fingertips. For a brief, beautiful moment, she was no longer afraid. She was completely present, entirely alive in the music. Halfway through her performance, a minor slip occurred. She hit a wrong note, and for an instant, she froze. Her heart skipped, and panic threatened to take over. But then she remembered the advice she had been given so many times. Mistakes were part of music, part of life. She smiled faintly to herself and kept going, letting the melody flow naturally. The wrong note became just another sound, another part of the story she was telling. She realized that imperfection did not diminish the beauty of her music. It made it human. As the final notes approached, her confidence grew stronger. She played with feeling, her fingers moving swiftly and gracefully, carrying both her emotions and her message to the audience. She could feel the tension in the room ease as the music wrapped around everyone present. When she played the last note, she let it linger, allowing the sound to resonate fully before letting her hands rest on the keys. Silence followed, deep and reverent, and then came the applause. It was softer than the competition, but it was genuine, and it filled her with warmth and satisfaction. She rose from the piano bench, bowing slightly, a shy smile on her face. The audience clapped and cheered, some standing to show appreciation. She felt her heart swell with pride, not because she had played perfectly, but because she had overcome her fear once more. She had hesitated under the spotlight, yes, but she had listened to the piano's whispers and let the music carry her through. She felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond applause. It was a quiet, steady confidence that she knew would grow with every performance. After the recital, a few parents came up to her, offering kind words and compliments. She thanked them softly, her cheeks warming with modesty. She noticed the young girl from the front row running up to her, eyes shining, and asking questions about how she had learned to play. She answered gently, sharing a bit about her practice and love for music. In that moment, she realized that her own courage and dedication could inspire others, that her story was not hers alone, but something that could ripple outward and touch other lives. As she packed her things and left the school, she felt lighter than she had in days. The fear was still present, lurking in the back of her mind, but it no longer controlled her. She had faced the stage again, played through hesitation, and allowed her music to speak louder than her doubts. She walked home slowly, enjoying the cool afternoon breeze, reflecting on the small victories that added up to something much greater than herself. Each performance, each note, was a step forward on her journey, and she knew that the piano would always be there to guide her, whispering its truths and helping her find her voice, one melody at a time. The following week, she found herself at a community music event, a small hall filled with local musicians, families, and neighbors. The stage was modest, the lighting soft, but the nerves she felt were just as strong as they had been in the larger halls. She carried her sheet music carefully, feeling the familiar weight of both anticipation and anxiety pressing on her chest. It had been a week since the school recital, and she had spent hours practicing every piece, replaying the memory of her small successes to boost her courage. Yet the thought of performing for a new audience made her stomach twist with nervous energy. Backstage, she watched others perform, each one with their own style and presence. Some played with confidence that made it seem effortless, while others trembled slightly, reminding her that everyone shared the same vulnerability when facing the spotlight. She quietly reminded herself that fear was natural, that even the most talented musicians felt it. She took a deep breath, trying to focus on what she loved about the piano, the feeling of each key beneath her fingers, the way music had always understood her better than anyone else. When her name was called, she walked toward the stage, the soft carpet beneath her feet doing little to calm her racing heart. The audience's faces were not as intimidating as she feared. They were a mix of curiosity, encouragement, and casual interest. Yet even with their gentle presence, she felt the familiar tremor of fear ripple through her body. She sat at the piano, adjusted the bench, and placed her fingers lightly on the keys, remembering the lessons from each previous performance. Breathe, trust the music, let it guide you. The first note came slowly, soft and delicate, almost like a whisper. She felt a small shiver run down her spine as the sound echoed through the hall. She had hesitated, but this time the hesitation lasted only a moment. She closed her eyes and let the music flow, letting the piano speak through her. Each note carried emotion. Each chord conveyed a part of her story that words could not capture. She felt herself melt into the melody, forgetting the audience, forgetting the stage, becoming one with the music. As she continued, the performance transformed. The nervous tension in her shoulders began to ease, replaced by a sense of freedom and connection. The piano was no longer just an instrument. It was a partner, responding to her emotions, guiding her through each phrase. She felt as though the music was lifting her, carrying her across the keys with grace and certainty. The audience, sensing this shift, leaned in, captivated by the change in her energy. Some closed their eyes, letting the sound fill their hearts, while others watched intently, understanding that something special was unfolding before them. Midway through the piece, she reached a particularly challenging passage, one that had caused her to falter during practice. Her fingers flew over the keys with precision, and the music flowed effortlessly. She realized she had passed a turning point. Her fear no longer dictated her movements. She had embraced the moment fully, trusting the piano and her own abilities. The melody swelled, carrying emotion that seemed to fill every corner of the hall, speaking louder than words ever could. It was as if the piano were whispering her courage, her dreams, and her determination to the world. She glanced briefly at the audience and noticed expressions of awe and admiration. A father held his child close, showing the little one how to appreciate the beauty of music. An older woman smiled, tears glistening in her eyes, recalling memories of her own youth spent playing and listening to piano. The young woman realized that her music had reached beyond her own heart, touching others in ways she had never imagined. This realization gave her strength, a quiet confidence that fueled the rest of her performance. The room seemed to shrink around her as she became fully immersed in the piece. She played with intensity and subtlety, each note carefully chosen, each pause meaningful. The piano was no longer just an object. It was a voice for her emotions, a storyteller of her experiences. She felt the whispers of doubt from the past fading further, replaced by a growing sense of control and creativity. Every chord she struck resonated with honesty. Every phrase carried her personal journey, and every lingering note told a piece of her heart. During the climax of the piece, she allowed herself to take risks, experimenting with dynamics and tempo. The piano responded like a conversation partner, echoing her intentions and enriching the music with its natural resonance. The audience reacted subtly but noticeably. They leaned forward, silent but attentive, absorbing every nuance. The young woman felt exhilaration, a sense of unity with both the piano and the listeners. She understood now that the stage was not an obstacle but a place where music could truly come alive, where emotions could flow freely and connect hearts. As she moved toward the conclusion, her fingers danced lightly over the keys, producing a delicate, lingering finish. The music tapered into silence, leaving a sense of fulfillment in the room. She held her hands above the piano for a brief moment, savoring the connection she had felt, the journey she had taken from hesitation to mastery. The applause began, soft at first, then building steadily, echoing through the hall. She felt a warmth spread through her, a recognition not only of her talent, but of the courage it had taken to reach this moment. After she rose from the bench, bowing slightly to the audience, she felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The piano had guided her, whispered to her, and allowed her to share a part of herself that words could never express. She realized that her performances were more than technical displays. They were conversations with her own heart, invitations for others to experience her journey. She thanked the audience quietly, her smile genuine and radiant, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the opportunity to connect through music. Backstage, she received warm congratulations from fellow performers and teachers. Each compliment reinforced the idea that her dedication and honesty had made an impact. Yet what mattered most to her was not the praise but the knowledge that she had overcome her own hesitation. She had faced her fear once again, and the piano had carried her through, speaking louder than her doubts. The lesson she learned was simple yet powerful. Music was a living entity, capable of transforming both the player and the listener when approached with courage and sincerity. That evening, walking home with the echo of applause still in her ears, she reflected on her growth. She thought about the early days of practice, the long hours spent alone, the moments of self-doubt that had felt insurmountable. Now, she could see those struggles as steps in her journey, necessary experiences that had led her to this point of connection and confidence. She understood that hesitation would always exist, but she had learned how to move beyond it, how to let the piano whisper her story and transform fear into expression. She sat by her window later that night, placing her hands on the keys of her own piano at home. The notes flowed naturally, effortlessly, carrying the emotions of the day and the week into the familiar room. She smiled softly, knowing that each performance, each step on the stage, was a chance to grow, to explore, and to share her heart with the world. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, she felt a sense of mastery not only over the piano but over the fear that had once held her back. She thought about the audience, the way the music had reached them, and the young girl who had watched her with wide eyes. She realized that her journey was no longer just about herself. It was about inspiring others, showing them that courage and expression could overcome hesitation. Each performance was a chance to whisper her story, to offer a small piece of her heart to anyone willing to listen. And in that understanding, she felt both humble and empowered, ready to continue playing, learning, and sharing, knowing that the piano's voice would always guide her, louder than words ever could. The next event she attended was a regional music festival, a larger stage than any she had faced before. The hall was grand, the lights brighter, and the audience larger. Her heart pounded as she entered, a mix of anticipation and fear running through her veins. She had grown more confident over the past performances, but the scale of this event was different. She walked backstage, observing the other performers warming up, their fingers dancing over instruments, their expressions focused and determined. She took a moment to steady herself, reminding herself that fear was part of the journey and that the piano had always been her guide. She sat quietly in the corner, reviewing her sheet music and rehearsing mentally. Each note, each passage had been practiced countless times. Yet she felt that the music she had mastered alone at home had a different life on stage. It was as if the piano and the audience were part of a single conversation, and she had to find the right words through the keys. Her fingers brushed over the keys of a practice piano nearby, feeling the familiar texture and letting the music flow in her mind. She took deep breaths, imagining herself walking onto the stage, the lights, the audience, and the first note that would start the story. Her name was announced, and a ripple of attention swept through the audience. She walked toward the grand piano with measured steps, feeling the soft weight of expectation pressing on her shoulders. When she reached the bench, she adjusted her position, sat, and placed her hands lightly on the keys. The bright lights made the audience almost invisible, but she could sense them watching, waiting. Her heart raced, but she told herself to breathe and focus on the music, letting it carry her through. The first note came slowly, and she felt a familiar shiver of fear and excitement. The sound echoed through the hall, soft and clear, but it held a certain command, as if the piano itself was speaking with authority. She closed her eyes and let the music take over. The notes flowed more freely than before, each one carrying her emotions outward, each chord a whisper of her journey and her heart. The audience remained quiet, captivated by the intimacy and honesty in her playing. As the performance progressed, she began to take more risks with tempo and dynamics, exploring the full range of expression the piano allowed. The music was no longer a series of practiced notes. It had become a conversation, a story unfolding with each passing measure. She felt completely absorbed, her own fear disappearing as she let the piano guide her fingers. Every key she pressed, every chord she struck, seemed to carry her beyond herself, reaching the audience with an honesty that words could never achieve. Midway through the piece, a dramatic shift occurred. She moved from soft, gentle melodies to powerful, intense passages. Her fingers flew across the keys with energy and precision, each note resonating in the hall. The piano spoke with a voice she had never fully realized before, expressing strength, vulnerability, and courage in a single sweep of music. She felt the audience respond, though silently, their attention fixed on her and the sound. She understood now that music was more than performance. It was connection, a bridge between her inner world and the hearts of others. The climax of the piece was a moment of complete immersion. She lost herself in the music, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm, her mind focused solely on the flow of notes. She had faced hesitation and fear countless times, and now she could channel it into energy and emotion. Each chord, each arpeggio, seemed to speak not only for her but for everyone who had ever felt fear and doubt. She realized that this was the true power of music, to carry emotion across barriers and touch people directly. The audience was captivated. Some leaned forward, eyes closed, letting the music fill their senses. Others watched intently, unable to look away from the performer who seemed to pour her soul into every note. She noticed subtle reactions. A tear here, a smile there, people sitting in stillness, absorbing the sound. She felt a profound connection, a sense that the piano had become an extension of herself, and through it, she was speaking to each person in the room. The hesitation that had plagued her earlier performances had completely vanished. There was only the music and its message. As the piece neared its conclusion, she slowed the tempo, allowing each note to linger, to breathe, to resonate in the hall. She poured her remaining energy into the final chords, letting them ring with clarity and emotion. The hall was silent for a heartbeat, hanging on the last note as if suspended in time. Then, slowly, the sound faded, leaving a tangible sense of awe and fulfillment in the room. She lifted her hands from the keys and took a deep breath, feeling the quiet satisfaction of having given her all. The applause began softly, then grew louder, swelling into a wave of appreciation that filled every corner of the hall. She rose from the bench, bowing slightly, feeling the warmth of recognition and admiration. Her cheeks flushed with joy, but more importantly, with pride in her courage and her music. She had faced the largest stage yet, and the piano had guided her through, speaking louder than any hesitation, louder than any fear. After the performance, fellow musicians and attendees approached her, offering compliments and words of encouragement. Each remark reinforced the realization that her music had truly touched others. She felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that she had shared a part of herself, that her dedication and honesty had been recognized. Yet, beyond the praise, what stayed with her was the internal satisfaction, the knowledge that she had performed not for approval but for the love of music and the joy of expression. Later that evening, she sat quietly at her own piano at home, replaying the experience in her mind. The echoes of the performance, the applause, and the connection with the audience lingered like a gentle warmth. She allowed her fingers to move over the keys, exploring the melodies that had carried her through the day. Every note seemed to remind her that the journey was ongoing, that each performance, each step on the stage, was a new opportunity to grow and to share her story. She reflected on her growth from the very first moment she had hesitated under the spotlight. The fear had not disappeared entirely, but she had learned to listen to the piano, to let it guide her through hesitation, to turn uncertainty into expression. She understood now that music was not simply about technical skill. It was about honesty, courage, and connection. The piano had been her teacher, her companion, and her voice, allowing her to communicate in ways words never could. As the night deepened, she looked at her reflection in the darkened window, seeing a young woman transformed by her experiences. She had faced fear repeatedly and discovered that courage was not the absence of fear but the choice to continue despite it. Each performance, each note, each moment of hesitation overcome had brought her closer to her own voice, her own story, and her own confidence. She realized that the piano would continue to guide her, to whisper the truths she carried inside, and to help her reach others in ways that transcended language. She sat for a long time, hands resting on the keys, eyes closed, listening to the quiet echoes of her own music. The room was still, the piano silent, but she felt the presence of the melodies that had passed through her, the connection she had made, and the courage she had discovered. She knew that the journey was far from over, that each stage, each audience, would bring new challenges and new opportunities. Yet she also knew that she had learned the most important lesson, that when she allowed herself to trust the piano, to follow its whispers, she could overcome hesitation, express her deepest emotions, and touch the hearts of those who listened. And in that knowledge, she found peace, joy, and the quiet strength to continue her musical journey. The morning after her festival performance, she woke with a quiet sense of pride. Her body still felt the lingering tension of the stage. Her fingers ached slightly from hours of playing, yet her heart was lighter than it had been in years. She reflected on all the performances she had done, each one a step further into her own courage and expression. It was strange to think that just a few weeks ago, she had hesitated at the very first note in a small school recital. Now, she had faced multiple audiences, each larger than the last, and had allowed the piano to tell her story in ways words could never capture. She spent the morning practicing at home, but this time her approach was different. She played not for perfection or approval, but for the joy of connection and expression. The piano felt alive beneath her hands, responding to every subtle movement, carrying not just notes but emotion. She experimented with new melodies, letting her fingers wander and explore, listening carefully to the sounds she created. She smiled softly as she realized that she was no longer afraid of mistakes. Every wrong note was just another sound in her story, a small imperfection that made the music human. Later that day, she received messages from people who had attended the festival. Some were brief notes of encouragement, others longer messages describing how moved they had been by her music. One parent mentioned how their child had been inspired to take piano lessons after hearing her play. Another wrote about feeling tears in their eyes, how the music had reminded them of hope and courage. She felt a warm rush of gratitude and humility reading these words. Her journey had not been about applause or recognition. It was about sharing a piece of her heart. And now she saw that the music had reached beyond her own experience to touch others. She spent the afternoon walking in a nearby park, letting the fresh air clear her mind. The sun was warm, and the world seemed full of possibilities. She thought about how far she had come, from the shy girl who had hesitated under the spotlight to someone who could now perform with confidence and expressiveness. She realized that every fear she had faced, every trembling hand and racing heartbeat, had been a step toward growth. The piano had been her guide, her companion, her voice, and in trusting it, she had discovered something within herself she had never known existed. That evening, she returned home and sat quietly at her piano. The room was dimly lit, the shadows soft against the walls. She played slowly, deliberately, savoring each note and chord. The music carried her memories of the past weeks. The nervous anticipation of the first recital, the growing confidence at the community event, and the full immersion of the festival performance. Each note was a reflection, a memory, a piece of her journey. She felt a profound sense of connection not just with the piano, but with herself, with the people she had reached, and with the music itself. As she played, she thought about the young girl who had watched her in awe at the community event. She remembered the small, wide-eyed face, the curiosity, and the excitement. She realized that her own courage and honesty had inspired someone else to explore their own dreams. The thought filled her with warmth and purpose. She understood that music was not only a personal journey, but also a way to encourage and touch the lives of others. Every performance, every moment of vulnerability and honesty, could ripple outward in ways she could never fully predict. She reflected on the lessons she had learned along the way. Fear was a constant companion, but it did not need to control her. Courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. Music was not simply about skill or technique. It was about honesty, connection, and expression. The piano had taught her to listen, to trust, and to communicate in a language that transcended words. She felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that she had embraced these lessons, that her journey had led her to this place of understanding and confidence. Days passed, and she continued to practice and perform whenever opportunities arose. She sought out small gatherings, community events, and local competitions, each time bringing the same dedication, honesty, and emotion to her playing. The pattern was becoming familiar. Initial hesitation, a brief struggle with fear, and then the transformative experience of letting the piano guide her. Each performance strengthened her confidence and deepened her love for the music. She began to notice subtle changes in herself, in the way she carried herself, in the way she approached challenges outside of music. The courage she had developed at the piano began to influence all areas of her life. She also began to mentor a few younger students, sharing the lessons she had learned. She taught them not just about technique and practice, but about courage, perseverance, and the joy of honest expression. She emphasized that mistakes were part of learning, and that music was a way to share feelings when words were not enough. Watching her students grow and find their own confidence brought her immense satisfaction. She realized that her journey was no longer just her own. It had become a part of a larger story, one that she could help nurture in others. One afternoon, she received an invitation to perform at a citywide music event, a chance to play in front of a much larger audience than she had ever faced. She felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness, recalling the first moment she had hesitated under the spotlight. Yet, she also felt a quiet certainty that she could trust herself and the piano. She began to prepare, practicing diligently, but also allowing herself to enjoy the process, to explore the music, and to embrace the emotions it evoked. She was no longer focused solely on perfection. She was focused on authenticity, on letting her story come through every note. The day of the citywide event arrived. She walked onto the stage, feeling the weight of the bright lights and the attentive audience, but also carrying the lessons of every performance she had given. She sat at the grand piano, placed her hands on the keys, and took a deep breath. The first note came gently, carrying the accumulated experience of her journey. As she continued, she felt the music guiding her, lifting her beyond fear and hesitation. Each phrase flowed naturally, expressing her story with honesty and grace. The audience was captivated, some leaning forward, some closing their eyes, all listening intently to the emotion in the music. During the climax of the performance, she felt a surge of energy and connection. The piano seemed to speak with a voice stronger than ever, carrying her courage, her joy, her vulnerability, and her determination. She realized that she was no longer performing for herself alone. She was performing for everyone who had ever doubted themselves, for everyone who had ever hesitated before taking a step, and for everyone who needed to hear a story of perseverance and hope. Her hands moved swiftly and confidently across the keys, each note resonating with clarity and meaning. As the final notes faded, she let them linger, feeling the resonance fill the hall. Silence followed for a heartbeat, and then the applause erupted, powerful and heartfelt. She stood, slightly trembling but smiling, overwhelmed by the realization that she had come so far. The piano had guided her every step, whispering louder than words ever could, transforming hesitation into expression, fear into courage, and solitude into connection. After the performance, she received messages, compliments, and warm greetings from audience members. Many shared how the music had touched them, how it had reminded them of hope, courage, and the power of persistence. She felt deeply grateful, not for the recognition, but for the ability to share her journey and to inspire others. The piano had been her teacher, her partner, and her voice, and now it had become a bridge to others' hearts. She understood that her story, told through music, could reach further than she had ever imagined. That night, she returned home and sat quietly at her piano. The room was calm, the soft glow of a lamp illuminating the keys. She played slowly, savoring each note and chord, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. From the first hesitant note in a small school recital to the commanding, expressive performance at the citywide event, she had grown not only as a musician but as a person. She understood that fear would always exist, but courage, perseverance, and trust could transform it into something beautiful. She closed her eyes, listening to the music as it flowed through her hands, feeling the echoes of all the performances, all the emotions, and all the connections. She realized that this was only the beginning. The piano would continue to guide her, whispering its truths, helping her grow, and allowing her to share her story in ways that words never could. She felt a quiet strength, a deep sense of fulfillment, and a profound joy in knowing that her journey of music, courage, and connection was just unfolding. Note by note, melody by melody, story by story.